Okay, good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started with our Tree School online program for today. We're really excited that you've joined us today for our Tree School online course. I am Alicia Christensen, the OSU Extension Forestry Agent for Douglas County, and it's my pleasure to be your host today for our Tree School online webinar. Tree School Online is a production of the OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and the Partnership for Forestry Education. We would like to give special recognition to the Oregon Forest Resources Institute for leading this project, and to the U.S. Forest Service and the Oregon Department of Forestry for giving us a grant to cover our expenses. I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping details before we go ahead and start our webinar today. So those of you who are a little more familiar with Zoom, this could be a refresher, but tune in if you're a little less familiar. This will help give you some guidelines here. So in your Zoom toolbar, that should be located at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, go ahead and scroll your cursor over the area in the bottom of your screen, and it should pop up. On some hardware, such as iPads, the Zoom toolbar is on the top of your display, so you might have to play with that to see where your Zoom toolbar is. Audio is muted for all participants, so you don't need to worry about muting yourself. We've done that for you. And same with video. Video is not available for participants, so your video is off. If you have any written questions for our presenter, go ahead and post those in the Q&A box, and that's located in the Zoom toolbar. I will monitor that throughout the webinar, and at the middle and end of the presentation, our presenter will go ahead and answer questions that are posted in the Q&A box. So be sure to use that for your questions. If you have any technical problems, post those in the chat box instead. So post those in the chat. This is monitored throughout the entire webinar. And thank you to Jacob Putney, who is monitoring that and helping me co-host today. Don't post any questions in the chat. Be sure to post those in the Q&A. The chat can also be used if you want to send any messages to our panelists here or participants of the webinar, either individually or as a group. Resources that are mentioned throughout the presentation today, they can be found on the Tree School Online Class Guide page, which is easily reached from the knowyourforest.org page, which houses our Tree School Online webpage. So if you go to knowyourforest.org, you can find our Tree School Online page, and all the resources we talk about will be covered there. If you click on the webinar description once you're in that page and look for the webinar that you're searching for information for, immediately above each webinar description will be a link to all the instructor resources covered today. If you're in need of any continuing education credits for any sort of professional organization, such as Oregon Professional Logger, please visit the resources section of the Tree School Online page. We are recording this webinar. This webinar will be archived as a YouTube video, and it will be accessible from the Tree School Online page as well. And during this webinar, we will use the polling feature a couple of times, once at the beginning and once at the end for a final evaluation. Polls should pop up on your screen in a little box, and after you answer the questions, the poll can then be closed. If for some reason you don't see a poll pop up, check your Zoom toolbar for a lighted button that says polls. And if the button appears, then a poll should pop up when you press it. So it'll only be there if a poll is active. Now that's all of our housekeeping that I have. I'd like to introduce you to our presenter today, Stephen Fitzgerald. Stephen Fitzgerald is a professor, director of the College of Forestry Research Forest, and extension specialist in silviculture. He has a joint appointment at OSU in the Department of Forest Engineering, Resources and Management, and in the Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program. And Steve has been with OSU for over 37 years. So thank you, Steve. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Alicia. Thank you for everyone that's on board. Normally, I like to do these types of classes actually out in the field where we actually get to plant some trees. make some mistakes, but learn from our mistakes and move on. I have a lot of information I'm going to present today, and I have a tall order here because I'm talking about reforestation after a timber harvest, but also in post-fire conditions, which, depending on what you plan to do, if part of your property burned or not, that has come up, as you know, with the recent fires. So it's a topic that's on a lot of woodland owner minds. I guess what I'd like to do is let you know that I've put a lot of resources, publications in the resource box that Alicia mentioned. And also this PowerPoint, because I'm going to go through it fairly rapidly to be able to get through everything. This will also be on in that box of materials as well. So you can refer back to this in case you missed something. So maybe we could pull up the first poll, and this poll is about where you're from. And this would help me kind of tailor some of my questions. So if you could just take a minute to fill this out, that will help me.
So it looks like many of you have already found the poll. So go ahead and keep answering those 3 questions that we have. One's asking where you're from, another asking what type of landowner or professional you are representing here today, and the third is how many acres of forest land do you own or manage. So looks like we have a wide spread of participants here in each of these categories. And we'll go ahead and just give that another few seconds or so, and then we'll share the results with everyone. So looks like it's slowing down. Everybody's probably answered. All right, go ahead and share. Can you see that there, Steve?
Yeah, I can. So it looks like most of you are from the Willamette Valley, some from the coast. A few folks from Central or Eastern Oregon, and I do have some examples from there. We got some from Washington and other places of the U.S. And let's see here, looking at the over 50% are woodland owners. Some are natural resource professionals or agency professionals, and other. And it looks like from an acreage perspective, a fair amount of you own about 10 to 40 acres, 40 to 100, and lesser amounts. And then some of you don't, because you're probably here as a professional or just to learn a little bit more about reforestation practices. So, okay, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. So I'm going to continue on. So as Alicia mentioned, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. After about halfway through this, we'll stop and take some of the questions from the first half of this, and then I'll proceed on the second half, and we'll take questions at the end. So the really purpose of this webinar is to really talk about reforestation after timber harvest and post-fire salvage. We're going to review some basic steps in the reforestation process and talk about free to grow, which is an important concept. There's been a lot of discussion about natural seeding or natural regeneration versus planting or artificial regeneration. I'll talk a little bit about climate and how that figures into planting various species and seed zones, and vegetation control and sources of assistance. One publication you might want to look at first provides an overview. After this webinar is a publication on successful reforestation. It's an overview, and it kind of goes through some of the things that I'm going to mention here today. So, as I mentioned, this is about reforestation after timber harvest or after, say, salvage harvesting here if your property burned. and or a significant portion of your property burned, and you're going to salvage the timber, which is has commercial value, and then replant after that. Maybe some of you are just interested in planting trees just because. You might have some places on your property that you don't currently have trees and may want to put some on there, or you just want to learn more about reforestation. So regarding the fire and fire salvages, just so you know that there's a lot of needs and questions out there. About 1 million acres burned in Oregon, and what we don't know is how many seedlings will be needed to replant those acres, because we don't know how many will be salvage logged. What species and what seed sources should they be? Where will we get the seed? We can get them from parent trees out in the woods or from seed orchards, and looking at who will grow them. Currently, the nurseries do not have the capacity to grow all of these, so it'll take a while to ramp that capacity up. So I don't want to pretend to know what your values or your objectives are for your property. And so this slide really is to kind of think about, are you more of a passive manager or more active? And part of that depends on your values and goals for your property. And so as far as passive, you let nature take its course, let it work on its own. Or are you actively managing your property for timber and other resources where you're either harvesting and replanting, because you are required after a commercial harvest to replant, or maybe you're somewhere in the middle where you do some active harvest and some planting, but maybe augment that with some natural regeneration over time. So all of this starts with really planning, and it's kind of this is really important. It's kind of like links in a chain, and of course, the weakest link causes a break, and that can cause problems. But really, think about when and where you're going to harvest, and then replant following that harvest. So we're going to talk about all this, matching seedlings to the site. And ordering seedlings, preparing the site for planting if it's not already, and how do you transport, handle, and plant those seedlings correctly. And then, of course, looking and monitoring to see how well those seedlings are growing and whether they have established and will meet the reforestation requirements we have in the state of Oregon after harvest. And of course, if there's any corrective action, it's best to determine what that action is and take it sooner than later. So some of this pre-planning is important. We're going to talk about how you kind of assess the site conditions and the seedling environment. You know, what will the seedlings experience when you plant them on your site? And look at management and operational constraints that you might have on your property. And come up with some way to prescribe what your reforestation options are going to be, whether it's planting a mix of species, maybe augmenting that to encourage natural regeneration, and of course, obtaining seedlings and then getting them planted. And this will be an important one because given the recent fires and the need for reforestation of those sites, particularly after salvage harvesting, is that planting contractors may be scarce. And so this should figure into your planning process, particularly if you have many acres to reforest that's beyond what you can do yourself. So in the reforestation requirements for Oregon after harvest is that trees need to be free to grow by year 6. So what do we mean by free to grow? Well, this definition is in the illustrated manual for forest practices laws in Oregon that the Oregon Forest Resources Institute has published. But basically, it's a tree or a stand of well-distributed trees of acceptable species and form that have a good chance of becoming healthier and taller than the neighboring grass and brush competition. Basically, a free-to-grow tree or stand is one that you could walk away from and you'd be pretty self-assured that it's going to take off and not need any further nurturing or weed control. So this picture right here shows a tree that was planted 2 years after a fire, 3 years after a fire, and 2 years after a salvage. And these pine seedlings are very vigorous. They are free to grow. Of course, here in the Coast Range, here's a Douglas-fir that is overtopped by ceanothus. This is not a free-to-grow seedling. This seedling actually needs help. And so when we talk about monitoring the vegetation, it will be important to prevent or try to keep vegetation from suppressing or overtopping your seedlings so that they become free to grow. So what are some of your reforestation options? Well, they include obviously planting seedlings. Another one is natural regeneration or natural seeding, and this occurs from seeding or sprouting or layering using several silvicultural methods, regeneration methods. And I'm not going to go into all of the regeneration methods, but this is an attempt, a specific action you take to try to encourage natural regeneration. Another term is advanced regeneration, and this is natural regeneration that may be on the site that established on its own with no help from you. There was no intention, but sometimes on some sites, this advanced regeneration can be used to and released so that it grows to maturity. And of course, combinations of both planting and natural regeneration. In some of the other webinars that we have hosted, there's been a lot of questions about natural regeneration. Well, I don't want to plant trees. I want to come back naturally. So the success for natural regeneration depends on kind of three things. And there's a lot of bullet points under these. Is you got to have a seed source, a cone crop. You got to have a seed bed, and the seed bed for most conifers, mineral soil is the best seed bed to regenerate on, not duff. And so sometimes after a disturbance like fire, that's often a perfect seed bed if there's seed in surrounding seed trees to provide a seed bed for natural regeneration. And of course, the environment in which the seed germinates and grows is important. Are you in a drought, severe drought, or a severe frost that might kill germinating seedlings, things like that affect the germination and establishment of seedlings from seed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some advantages and disadvantages of natural regeneration and planting, but some general things to consider for this is for natural regeneration. It depends on species and whether there's been a fair amount of success for different species. So for example, Western hemlock, if that's what you're interested in, produces a cone crop and readily regenerates on its own. On the east side, lodgepole pine produces a abundant seed crop and regenerates very well on its own. Other species, this may not be the case. And so oftentimes natural regeneration is not even. It can be dense in one area and more open or absent in another area in a harvest unit. If you have advanced regeneration, will it release if trees are removed above them? It depends on how old they are and how long they've been suppressed. So if you're going to rely on natural regeneration, the Oregon Forest Practices Act requires a written plan because oftentimes it takes more than 6 years to get adequate natural regeneration to restock an area after timber harvest. And so A written plan, basically you have plan A, which is to rely on natural regeneration, but plan B in your written plan would be, what if that doesn't happen? What are you going to do to augment the stocking? And we'll talk a little bit of what it takes to kind of promote natural regeneration. Some of that's out of your control, and maybe some is within your control. And we'll talk a little bit about tree species tolerances as it relates to both planted and natural regeneration. So let's talk about cone crops. So I spent a lot of time looking at tree crowns and cone crops, and maybe some of you do too. And cone crops, some trees produce take 1 year to produce a cone, and other species like pine take 2 years to produce a cone. And here's a Douglas-fir. You can see the cones up at the top, abundant. And this past year, we had a very abundant cone crop. And unfortunately, in some places, it burned up in fires. So, but the cone crops do not happen every year. And in fact, over many decades, we can see a variation in cone crop production. And what in the past, we've kind of collected cones and stored that seed with medium to heavy cone crops. And you can see oftentimes a heavy crop is followed by no crop or a very low crop. The production of cones is very energy intensive for a tree. And so you could have, you may have, you know, a couple of medium-sized cone crops close together and then have nothing for a while. And this varies by species. So, for example, Western larch in Central and Eastern Oregon may produce a good cone crop every 15 years, where Douglas-fir or ponderosa pine, it may be every 7 or 8, you get a really heavy crop. So that affects regeneration, natural regeneration success. Is obviously you got to have seed and you got to have a cone crop. The other thing, though, is do you have any, particularly in areas that burned, do you have enough surviving trees that potentially could provide seed across the unit or the area that you might be thinking about salvage harvesting, or a portion of the unit? If you're not going to salvage, then you're not really required to plant. But if you plan on salvaging, you will have to regenerate that site. And you may, if you have enough surviving trees, you may be able to get some natural regeneration, but I wouldn't rely on natural regeneration to restock the entire area. So here we have some trees that are scattered across this area that burned. And just so you know that there is limits to how far seed will travel depending on the species and the seed weight as far and wind patterns. So if you look at this graph here, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on the bottom we have sugar pine, Jeffrey pine, ponderosa pine. Those are heavy seeded species. And you can see that the distance and height at either a 5 to 10 mile an hour wind ranges from 1 to maybe 4 tree heights. And as you move to the right and look at Douglas-fir or Western hemlock, the seed is much lighter and travels across the area much further because of the small seed size. And so that's a factor in its dispersal across an area. So the question is, particularly after a wildfire, do you have enough seed sources distributed across the area that you can leave that would provide natural seeding and seedling establishment? Okay, so we take a look a little bit at natural and planted seedlings. Of course, natural, they're locally adapted. They're the best adapted to your site because they're right there. And if you get natural seeding, obviously you don't have to plant those trees and there's less upfront costs. but there could be a delay in regeneration, natural regeneration, because maybe you don't get a cone crop right away. It may take 2 or 3 or 4, maybe 5 years before a cone crop of sufficient size actually casts seed on the site. And so that infrequent seed years may be an issue for natural regeneration. In the meantime, you have to also think about that the vegetation now is coming back after a fire or after a disturbance. And so the seed that comes 3 or 4 or 5 years later when they germinate, will have a much harder time making it up through grass and other vegetation that has reestablished much quicker. And as I mentioned, the seedbed preparation, most conifers enjoy a mineral seedbed, including western hemlock, although western hemlock will regenerate on logs and duff because it can regenerate in the shade. It's very shade tolerant, and the logs in shade remain pretty moist for them to put their roots in and establish, like on nurse logs that you sometimes see in the Coast Range. So planted seedlings, though, it's quicker, it's more reliable than natural regeneration. It's easier to meet the legal requirements that you have after a harvest with planted seedlings. Higher upfront costs because you have to purchase those seedlings and then the cost to plant those seedlings. But you have an opportunity here to use genetically improved stock, or it could allow you to plant desirable species, particularly if you have a site that's been high graded, where maybe some of the more valuable species have been removed. You have an opportunity now to plant other valuable species back on, or species that are more appropriate for the site. So here's a piece of property that burned in the Beachy Creek fire. And you can see here, there's an area here, there's a meadow or a pasture. You don't have to replant that. But what I did here was think about this from a salvage perspective, is that I have a fair amount of pretty good trees that I've circled in red, and then I have some individual trees that I marked to leave in with these red triangles that you see up here. And then what I have here is that part of this property could be salvaged, leaving these islands of green trees to provide structure and habitat and variety and aesthetics, but also to provide seed that might help regenerate the spaces in between. I probably wouldn't rely solely on natural regeneration. I probably would plant trees in here as well, but I might be able to get away planting fewer with the hope that natural regeneration will also occur. And so the disturbance from the fire and disturbance from the salvage logging will help create a mineral seedbed that would be conducive for regeneration of trees from natural seeding. So this whole thing kind of begins with assessing the seedling environment on your property, thinking about the climate and the exposure that your seedling is going to face, or if it's even a natural regeneration. When the seed falls and it hits the ground, where does it, if it hasn't gotten eaten by rodents, what is that germinate going to experience when it begins to germinate in the spring? Seed fall occurs in the fall, overwinters, and the seed begin to germinate in the spring. And so all of these things affect the performance of either planted or in particularly regeneration from seeds. So the aspect, is it a south slope or a north slope that gets to heat load, the slope, how steep it is, and the angle at which it faces the sun, the elevation, the soil type, And of course, the vegetation that may compete with those seedlings and other things like animals and root disease can also affect the performance and survivability of your regeneration. So knowing these seedling characteristics, you can do a better job of trying to match the seedling or species to the site. And so we're going to talk about species tolerance to environmental stressors, and a little bit on their susceptibility to insects and disease. We're going to talk about a genetic fit and a little bit about, in respect to that, climate change, and take a look at seedling size and form. And this is called the stock type. Not all seedlings that you purchase potentially from a nursery are the same. They have different sizes and ages. So let's talk about species tolerances, or maybe their talents. So each species has its own set of adaptations to stressors like shade or flooding or frost or even wildlife damage. And what we can do is we can kind of rank these, subjectively rank these, to look at their performance and maybe try to match them to sites that they would do well on and be able to tolerate the kind of environment that they're going to be growing in. So in this table, I have the species over here on the left, and at the top we have some performance categories. So level of use, the growth rate, its shade tolerance, animal damage, frost or cold tolerance, its tolerance to drainage or wet soils, and to drought and heat. So a 5 means it's high performance or high tolerance, and a 1 is a low performance or a low tolerance to this. So for example, if we kind of take a look at Douglas-fir, its high level of use, has a high growth rate. It's in the middle as far as shade tolerance. It can tolerate some shade, doesn't like too much, can handle some animal damage, kind of middle of the road for frost, but it does not like wet or soggy soils. And we see this oftentimes where Douglas-fir will die after a pretty hefty wet year, particularly on soils that are poorly drained. In comparison, we can look at ponderosa pine. Its level of use is a little bit lower. Growth rate is pretty good. It does not like shade. It likes more open conditions. It's tolerant of animal damage and tolerant of frost. It can grow in dry sites, but also in poorly drained sites, and it can handle drought and heat. And so knowing these, their ability to tolerate certain things, you can match them to the condition you have. So if you have a hotter, drier site, you may want to pick a species that can tolerate that condition, or say something that's wet. You might want to use something like Western red cedar if that will grow there. So this is kind of important in thinking about reforesting your property. Okay, so the other things you can do or use is the NRCS soil maps can give you clues as to the productivity of different sites for different species, as far as and their temperature and other environmental conditions for that site. I often look for vegetative clues. Looking across the site, do I see oak on that site? With Douglas-fir, that probably tells me it's more of a dry site, and I may not want to put Douglas-fir back on it if it has a lot of oak. Likewise, if it's kind of wet, it might have some sedges or rushes, and maybe I'm probably not going to plant Douglas-fir there. I might not even plant any trees in that wet spot, depending on how wet it is. Might plant some Western red cedar or something like that can tolerate that type of situation. But other things to think about are you planting are trees going to are you planting under some shade? And is the tree species going to be shade tolerant? But I like to mention here that just because a species is tolerant of a stressor like shade doesn't mean it likes it. So Western hemlock is one of our most shade tolerant trees, but it loves full sun, but it can grow in some level of shade. So just thought I'd mention that. So what are some species that we either plant or are regenerated naturally on some sites? Well, I think this is probably, you're probably familiar with a lot of these. Of course, Douglas-fir being the main one, but for our pines, we have Willamette Valley ponderosa pine that's planted. Of course, ponderosa pine in central and eastern Oregon is planted, as well as lodgepole and sugar pine. True firs like grand fir and noble fir are planted. Spruces, Sitka spruce and Engelmann spruce are planted or regenerate from seed. And hemlocks, Western hemlock is actively planted. Mountain hemlock, probably not so, but mostly from natural regeneration from mountain hemlock. So that's high elevation, 6,000 feet. And of course, Western red cedar and a whole host of hardwoods that either regenerate on their own or are planted within riparian areas and in riparian restoration projects. And here we have an alder plantation that was planted to basically a 9 by 9 foot spacing for wood production. So let's talk a little bit about genetic adaptations, because this is really important when it comes to matching seedlings to your site and making sure that they fit your area genetically and match the environment that, and so across the state is broken up into seed zones. And so these are local adaptations for conifers, and within this seed zone, and the seed zones have gone under revision, and I've shown here the old seed zones, which still exist, but also the new seed zones. And if you notice on the new seed zones that for Douglas-fir, for example, they're much narrower but longer north to south, and that formulates a more similar environment, a genetic environment in which those trees developed over thousands and millions of years. So the old seed zones, there was 36 in the state, and now there's only 16 in Western Oregon. And there is protocol for moving seed within these seed zones or adjacent ones. But the idea here is that you don't really want to take Douglas-fir from Southwest Oregon down here and plant it up on the North Coast. From a genetic fit, that's too far away. And if you do that, the seedlings will experience some chronic health problems. So this is what the actual seed zones look across Oregon. You can see in Western Oregon, this is for Douglas-fir. And most of the fires, so if some of you are going to purchase seedlings over the next few years, most of the fires were in seed zone 8, 9, 12, 14, and probably 10. And so if your property is within one of those seed zones, that's the seed zone in which you want to purchase seed or seedlings that were grown from the seed in that seed zone. Now, sometimes somebody may have some Douglas-fir available, and you might be tempted to take it because seedlings are scarce. But if it's from too far away, I would not purchase those seedlings and put them on my property because they are what we call off-site, and they end up with chronic health problems. So here's a site that has Douglas-fir that was planted with seedlings that were from some seed zone, but we're not sure which one. But these trees are off color, the ones that I have arrows to. And if you look at that nice green tree in the middle, that's from that site. But these other ones were planted, and they were kind of bargain seedlings that the landowner purchased, but not knowing where the seed zone was. And at this point, they're just merchantable. And so this would be a case where you may want to harvest these trees and then replant with more appropriate seedlings from your seed zone. But in many cases, if the trees are too far off site, they may not even get to a merchantable size. So my colleague, Glenn Ahrens, we've been working on a kind of a climate change project, but he did some work here looking at, we get this question all the time, maybe many from you, about, okay, with climate change, what should I be planting on my property for the future that will survive? And so Glenn did some background work with some geneticists, and, he has some quotes here, but what they're saying here is currently the population of trees are expected to be poorly adapted to future climates. So part of the answer to that is how far out in the future are we talking about? Are we looking at 30 years and the temperatures might go up a degree or two? Are we looking at 100 or 150 years? That's an important question because further out the temperatures may go up higher, and of course some species lose and others gain in a climate scenario like that. But some of the things that he found out is that trees adapted to future climate may be found at lower elevations or further south. One idea is to use a mixture of seed sources. So seed sources from your existing zone and maybe seed sources from the zone just south of you to mix it up so that maybe you can provide a little buffer or because of the uncertainty over climate change over the life of the stand. And this might be called assisted migration. The one thing that you have to balance is the adaptation is that the trees you plant not only need to be adapted to current condition, but will they be adapted to the future condition that they're growing into? And it's a bit of a moving target. If you put a seed type trees from a southern seed zone that's too far away right now, they may not do well. And even when the climate changes, because they didn't do well early in their life, they don't come back and all of a sudden perk up and are healthy again. If their growing environment is poor to begin with, they will remain low vigor and they'll have chronic health problems. So here are just some scenarios. Some are more pessimistic than others, but here is one where the yellow here this is for Douglas-fir, and this for 2041 to 2070 is that in yellow we see the habitat lost for Douglas-fir. We see some habitat gained for Douglas-fir under the blue. And it's interesting on this scenario, I'm not sure I believe it, it shows the Willamette Valley potentially as habitat gained for Douglas-fir. I'm not sure I believe that, but I suppose if it's accompanied with additional rainfall, that could happen. But other scenarios may be more pessimistic depending on which models are used. So here's one from Rayfelt. This is in red is the Douglas-fir, and the light greenish is the marginal habitat currently for Douglas-fir. So you see the Willamette Valley and you see some marginal habitats for Douglas-fir that ring that Willamette Valley. But in 30 years, this is the scenario I took. So for this model, you see the amount of red or the amount of Douglas-fir declining. And so this shows a fairly significant decline potentially in 30 years with this particular climate model. And so there are things, though, that, we model them, but we know that we have entered into a changing climate, increases in temperature. We know that fire seasons are longer, growing seasons are longer. But one of the things that we can do is test different seed sources and plant them and put them into common gardens. So here is a Douglas-fir performance test on the left. And this is a kind of like in your garden where you put a plot in and you try different types of seed for a given vegetable, and you look to see how well it performs. And so in that aerial view, you see some trees that are nice and dark and green and others that are not. And so the photo on the right shows a Douglas-fir that was planted in that common garden, and the seed source was from California. And so this particular seed source is not doing well because it is suffering from chronic needle cast or needle disease. And so it is way off-site given the current climate for this seed source. And so what some of the climate scientists think about assisted migration is maybe taking this in baby steps. Instead of taking something from California and moving it up here, maybe we just go a little further south and move something up to our area up here. So there are some current tools for selecting the seed source. I covered the current seed zones, and that's your go-to source for appropriate seed for your planted seedlings. But there's a couple of tools. There's climate-based seed deployment. One is called the seed lot selection tool, which is exploratory at this point, where you put in, and I'll show you an example, you put in your area and you choose a climate scenario, and it'll display areas where you might get your seed to have your seedlings grown so that you could plant them out on your property. And the other one is a seed zone matcher. I don't know much about this one, but it's coming soon. But maybe as an example of the seed lot selection tool, I manage the College of Forestry research forest. And so I have a little pin here about where the forest is. And I thought, I came down here and I said, well, I'm going to plant Douglas-fir, and I'm looking 30 years out, which would probably equate to an increase of about 2 degrees. Where should I get my seed to grow my seedlings today that will do well in that climate in 30 years? And I picked 30 years because I probably can grow a tree to a commercial size in 30 years. And if things really change, I can harvest that and redeploy maybe a different seed source going forward. But if you look at this, everything in orange, the redder it is, the greater the better the match. And if you look at where I'm at in Corvallis, is that I might be able to pull out seed collected from down around Roseburg or on the east flank of the Coast Range down there, and plant it, have the seed germinated and grown, and plant those seedlings on the research forest. And in fact, we are going to do that in the test. We have seed from the Roseburg area that we'll be planting out for this very reason. But anyway, these tools can only get better, and so stay tuned. But probably you have seen some of this already, is that some sites are already experiencing high levels of mortality. And these probably are already marginal sites for Douglas-fir, or maybe for pine in this case, where we see the trees are winking out or dying in the last few years, and particularly after 2015 when we had that hot drought. And that caused a widespread mortality across the region. And so on some of these marginal sites for Douglas-fir, these would be good sites probably not to plant Douglas-fir back. And so here's a case where trees were planted. I'm pretty sure these were planted because this understory all looks about the same age. If this was natural seeding, you'd see a variety in their sizes and ages. But there's oak in this stand. And so what's happening here is these young trees are on a fairly droughty site, and they're already starting to die. And so this might be a site, again, for either oak or ponderosa pine or something that can handle a hot, dry site. These trees will not make it to merchantability. And so, so thinking about the site, and now on some sites, you may have microsites or areas that are more harsh than others. And so here's a plantation of Douglas-fir, and in the background right here, there's a ponderosa pine. And this Douglas-fir is not happy. And it's not happy. Obviously, you can see the dead top and the brown needles. But you notice the cone crop. It's very unusual for young trees to have a cone crop, except when they're stressed and they're about ready to die. So this is a last-ditch effort to reproduce itself before it dies. And so when you see, if you've planted an area and you see areas within your planted areas that show trees like this, that's probably a change or a harsher site, and it's a site that Douglas-fir probably doesn't like. And so in thinking about your property and harvest, you may have microsites that maybe you don't want to just do a uniform plant of Douglas-fir. Or maybe it's a current Douglas-fir and oak site, and maybe you just want to remove the Douglas-fir and leave the oak and not worry about replanting Douglas-fir, because they probably won't make it in the long run given changes in the climate that we're experiencing currently. So a couple of things here is that on this is thinking about a lot of these marginal sites for Douglas-fir, or for whatever species that might be marginal. It could be marginal grand fir on a dry mixed conifer site in central or eastern Oregon, is that planting the next hardy species that can tolerate a hotter, warmer environment. And so those are the kind of what I call the no-brainer sites that maybe there you start with trying to think about a species change or a density, manage the stand under lower densities so that the resources of the site are compatible with or commensurate with the amount of trees that are growing to support those trees. And so again, consider establishing trees that are adapted to drought and higher temperatures for that location. So what I'd like to do is pause here, and maybe if there are questions in the Q&A, we can kind of discuss them. I went through a lot right there. And so I want to give you a chance to kind of digest that and maybe ask any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Steve. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A right now. But before we dive in, I wanted to ask you, we had one question that was left off of our original poll from the beginning. Would you like to ask that right now and get a feel for that, or would you like to skip over that?
We can skip it for now.
Okay, sounds good. So we'll move into questions. So our first one, someone asked, when you were discussing natural regeneration, you mentioned uncertainty around trees releasing. Could you explain what release means in that context?
Okay, I'm gonna, a good example of that would be, I'm gonna go back to this picture. Okay, so let's pretend that Douglas-fir is not dead, the younger Douglas-fir. So let's pretend for a moment that this Douglas-fir came in on its own. So we would call this advanced regeneration. Let's say it wasn't planted. So the question is the Douglas-fir here have been subject to competition from the overstory trees that you see here. So the question is how long has it been, what is the current health? How long has it been suppressed? If I went in and I removed, I don't know if can you see my cursor on this tree right here? Can people see this? Okay, so if I went in and removed this tree, would these Douglas-fir around it release? Do they, because sometimes trees can be suppressed so long, even though they're green, you remove the competition from overhead, is that then they still sit there. They just been suppressed too long. And so assessing the health of these. Now, obviously, these trees, they've got health problems from drought, but if they were healthy, and you were going to harvest some of these trees, would they have the capability to release and be viable and restock the property? And this would be important, particularly if you're managing in a multi-age fashion, where you're trying to look at different ages of trees, growing different ages of trees all together, or across an acre or two. So. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. In the context of natural regeneration, what is layering?
Okay, layering, that's a technique that sometimes you see with high elevation trees, or trees where the branches come down and they come in contact with the ground, and the branches actually germinate or develop roots, and then a separate tree. So it's a regeneration adaptation for some species, not necessarily for these, but it is a natural regeneration process.
Great. Another question we have: can cones on trees with crown scorch from fire still have viable seed? So, for example, Douglas-fir, ponderosa pine.
Yeah, really good question. The answer is yes, if it's a light scorch, that the needles are still on the tree. The tree, it may have a whole bunch of scorch, but there can be seed that's still viable in those cones. It really but if most of the needles are off and the cones are still on, most likely that's not the case. Now, we know some species like lodgepole pine and others, they're adapted to that, and the heat actually opens the cones and regenerates lodgepole pine, or even like knobcone pine, although knobcone pine is not a commercial species, but that's a fire-dependent species. I can't hear you.
Just figured that. Thanks. In the historical record, is there a correlation with colder or wetter years following high Douglas-fir cone crops?
I have not seen that. Cone crops, abundant crow crops relate to growth regulators, certain growth regulators, what I would say analogous to our hormones in animals that trigger that. We do know that cone production is lower on the energy list for a tree. And so that's why they don't produce cones every year per se. The energy the tree produces goes to things like diameter growth, height growth, things that are going to make it survive. And then, but perhaps, in better precip years, it would make sense that it would follow with a pretty good cone crop, or at least a moderate cone crop, because they're less stressed.
So we have a really great question about timing. So this person's interested in knowing timing for when to plant. How do you know how close you need to plant, and the method to do so, when to spray, thin, prune, all of those kind of things. So
okay, I will get into that. So I'll hold that question.
Great, thank you.
And if I don't answer all of it, we can come back to it at the end.
Great, sounds good. Another question we have, after a heavy rain, some large Doug-fir will fall over, and the root ball is included, but other adjoining trees survive. How does that affect those around that tree?
The ones that are still standing?
I think that's what they're asking that question. Yeah.
So there could be two things. I don't know how much, when the tree goes over, how much damage or disturbance to the surrounding trees might happen either at the ground level, or if the crown of that tree going over hits into an adjacent crown and breaks it, then that affects obviously the neighboring, that tree. That also happens when you fall timber as well, when tree goes through and, takes off part of the crown. So that does negatively affect the tree. So I'm not sure I answered it completely, but if I didn't, maybe we can come back to it later.
Certainly, yeah. If that person wants to elaborate on that question, feel free to type that in the Q&A.
Okay.
We only have about a couple minutes left in this Q&A, and then we'll go back into the rest of your presentation.
Okay.
But one question is how much do you fight for a Douglas fir crop when it looks like your current land and climate situation is not easily supporting Douglas fir anymore?
Well, that gets to like this photo right here, and these photos that I was showing you, is that, yeah, it gets to the point where like you're pushing a rope. It doesn't work. We're trying to make water go uphill. And I think we saw a lot of that after 2015. So there were a lot of sites that were planted across the west, west side with Douglas fir, and not all those sites were probably equally suited for Douglas fir. Yes, they grew, but after 2015, we saw what a very hot and deep drought can do on these sites that are marginal. So, you could have a harvest area where part of it is on a more northerly slope, and you could plant Douglas fir, and I think it'll be fine, even going into the next couple of decades for sure. But if part of that unit is on a south slope, maybe something else needs to be planted besides Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, or something that is more drought tolerant. So those are the sites where you're already having problems with trees, and you've seen it, and it's ramping up, those are the sites I would really seriously consider planting something different. And there may be some sites on low elevation that are actually not going to support trees at all. It may be just shrubs and grasses. So,
thank you. So one last question, and then we'll go back into the presentation. Could you briefly describe what other types of markets there are for trees other than Doug fir?
Yeah. Douglas fir probably is the number one, but ponderosa pine, at least on the east side, is the primary species over there, as well as inland Douglas fir. Over here in the Willamette Valley, there's a fair amount of planted ponderosa pine, Willamette Valley variety of ponderosa pine. It's just coming of age as far as its merchantability, but there is not a lot of markets yet for that. And so we're kind of betting on some future market. Whitewood, so Western hemlock. Western hemlock prices are pretty good right now. And on sites in the Coast Range where you have a lot of Swiss needlecast, it's a viable species to plant because Douglas fir will get infected and not do well. And so over in the kind of central to north coast, it's not so much maybe a climate change issue as it's a disease issue with Douglas fir. And the disease is sometimes it increases in severity in different years and subsides a bit, but it's been with us for quite a while, and it's gotten more severe over the last few decades. In the course of my career, Swiss needlecast only occurred in a few stands, and usually they were off-site trees. I can take you to stands that I know had Swiss needlecast back in the 80s when I first arrived in Oregon, and they were all on off-site trees. I mean, severely off-site. We don't know where the seed source came from. Well, that over time has built up, and we see an increase across the Douglas fir in the Coast Range on the west side. So,
Okay, thanks, Steve. So we have
Okay.
about 20 minutes left before our final Q&A period.
Okay.
Okay.
So we're going to move on. So let's talk a little bit about seedling form and age, what we call stock type. So tree seedlings that are planted out after fire, wildfire, or after a harvest or after a salvage harvest are grown in tree nurseries like you see here. So it's basically like your garden, but we're growing trees and seedlings. And sometimes a lot of times trees are also grown in greenhouses in plugs. And I'll show you some examples. But seedlings can be anywhere from less than a year old if they're grown in a plug in a greenhouse to perhaps up to 3 years old out in a field like you see here. And so the stock types here, I'll explain, but on the left are different sizes of plug seedlings. An S10 means it's 10 cubic inches in the plug, S15, 15 cubic inches, and S20, 20 cubic inches. Right now, a lot of Douglas-fir that is planted is a lot of the S15s and S20s. So these can be grown in less than a year, which is a really good advantage. They're more expensive than the ones on the right. Oftentimes, the ones on the right are called bare root. So these are seedlings that are grown in the fields that I just showed, and then they're lifted. That is, they have a machine that undercuts under that bed of seedlings and severs the roots, and then they're picked up, brought to a packing plant, sorted, and then packaged, and then you come and pick them up and plant them out. So in cases, if we go and plant those seedlings, sow those seedlings in a seed bed and they're grown for 2 years, it's called a 2-0, that's a standard type of seedling that's been planted in the past. Another one is a 1-1, where the tree seed is sown into a seed bed, grown for 1 year. Then those 1 year seedlings are undercut, picked up, and then planted in another bed at a wider spacing for another year. And you can see it produces a much more robust seedling, a larger caliper or diameter at the base, and a much more vibrant root system. And so 1-1s are pretty standard now. And then there's another one called a plug one. I don't have an example here, where the seedling is started in a small plug. Instead of an S10, it's started in an S4, 4 cubic, a little plug in the greenhouse. Then it's planted out in a bed and grown for another year. And that one's called a plug one. And it basically is 2 years old, or a year and a half years old. But a plug one and a 1-1 are very similar in their height and their diameter and their root mass. Now, the 2-1 is a seedling that started out like that 2-0. It was grown 2 years in a seed bed, and after 2 years, it was undercut, picked up, and planted in another bed at a wider spacing for another year. And it's a 2-1. It's a 3-year-old seedlings. Those are big seedlings. They're expensive because you've grown them for 3 years, and there's more nursery cultural work it takes to get them. They're heavy, and you can't pack as many out onto the site. But they do well on very productive sites, or sites where you expect browsing because they're a bigger seedling. They can handle a little bit more browsing. Or if there's more shrub competition, these larger seedlings often can plow through some of the shrubs. So that's a little background on stock type. Where you get these is that, and this is in the box of resources, there's a publication called Sources of Native Forest Nursery Seedlings that the Oregon Department of Forestry puts out. There's a list of 27 nurseries and with their website. And at these nurseries, then, if you go on their website, they'll have the species, the stock type, and the seed zone where those seedlings were grown from, and they'll list what they have available. And it's important to match the seed zone and elevation for your property when purchasing those. Usually they sell them either by or their cost. You have to actually get on their website to get their cost. They don't always give it out just if you're perusing the website. You'd actually have to call them to see what the cost is, either per 100 seedlings or per 1,000 seedlings. But, the range can be, upper 200s to getting close to $400 per 1,000 seedlings. So they're not cheap to grow, but the 2-1 would be pretty expensive. So, but you'd have to contact the nursery to see what those costs are per 100 or per 1,000. So this is a really good publication. It talks about seed zones and adaptation and gives you a really good background from the genetics standpoint. But so I would contact the nurseries. The Oregon Department of Forestry and our OSU Extension Forestry folks might have information on available seedlings. Sometimes the U.S. Forest Service or the BLM have surplus seedlings. Again, I would only purchase the surplus seedlings if they match genetically the zone that you're going to plant your seedlings at. In some cases, there may be some local reforestation cooperatives, and there's a forest seedling network that can help find seedlings that maybe match your seed zone. And as I mentioned, there's probably going to be a pretty good demand for seedlings in the next 2 or 3 years. And so you may, if you're going to either harvest timber or you're going to salvage your timber, I would encourage you to actually order your seedlings now in anticipation of your harvest, so that you'll be assured that you'll have them after your harvest is complete and you can get the seedlings in the ground as soon as possible. So this is where the planning comes in. So there was a question about spacing and a couple of things. So this picture is a little busy. It has a couple of different things. We have some existing trees that we've left, and then in the foreground there's an opening. And the opening in the foreground is more like a clear cut. And so you would need to plant more seedlings in the foreground than you would in the background, because you already have some overstory trees that contribute to the stocking to meeting the reforestation rules. Anyway, so the existing trees on site affect what the spacing and stocking level would be. And you can talk with an Oregon Department of Forestry stewardship forester to see what that might be for your situation. Do we expect any future natural regeneration to happen on its own? I think you could probably expect a little. Personally, I'm pessimistic about it, and so I tend to think I'll get some, but it may not be enough to restock my site. And I'll mention the reasons for that here in a second. So even when we plant and do a good job, there's usually some level of mortality of even planted seedlings. So here on the research forest, depending on the site, we might expect a 10% mortality of seedlings, 90% success. So that we would adjust how many trees we plant based on our success. And then, what's your objectives? Your owner objectives, and the site productivity. The more productive the site, the reforestation requirements require a higher number of seedlings, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And of course, this is one that if your objective is more on the timber side, is you don't want to plant like 1,000 seedlings per acre, and then have to come back at age 15 and thin some of them out. at a cost, and they're not big enough to pay their way out. And so, I like to plant trees wide enough so that I can let them grow and get up to 25, 28 years old, where then I can do a commercial thin without having to do that pre-commercial thin at age 15 or 18. And so that's that avoided additional cost. So the time to first thinning on most of our sites, and maybe for some of you on the west side, when your stand gets to be about 25 to 30 years old is when you might be able to do a commercial thinning. So I would only plant what I need to get trees up to grow without having to do that pre-commercial thinning at age 15. So here's just a suggestion. This is not cast in stone, but typically Douglas-fir, here on the forest that I manage, we plant at 11 by 11. And some places we're going to 12 by 12 because they're drier sites. But Western hemlock can handle a higher density because of its shade tolerance, and ponderosa pine on drier sites a little wider, and maybe even go wider than 12 by 12. And Douglas-fir on the central Oregon and east side might be at a 12 by 12. So I like to vary the spacing. So to add variety and structure to a developing stand. So it doesn't have to be perfect. If you're anal, then go for it. But you could have openings and gaps and what we call early cereal habitat, and still plant seedlings and vary the spacing. We had a planting where we told our planters to plant 5 by 5 in all the areas that we had burned piles. And then beyond that, we said, plant a tree wherever you want. We ended up with a spacing of 5 by 5 to 30 by 30. And the idea there was to make it look less like a plantation and more like how natural regeneration might come in on a site. But that was an objective that we had for that particular site. You might have a similar objective. And so that's where your objectives and values come in. But you should always check with the Oregon Department of Forestry to see what your minimum stocking levels would be, planting levels would be after harvest. It ranges from about 100 trees per acre, which is like 21 feet by 21 feet if we're talking about an even spacing, to 200 seedlings per acre on Douglas-fir sites. So that'd be about a 15-foot spacing between trees. Okay. So I'm going to finish that up on spacing. So let's talk a little bit about competing vegetation. So seedlings, they need sunlight, they need water in particular, they need nutrients to survive, but also an environment where they're not damaged by wildlife or other things. But competition is really important. Competing vegetation consumes water and nutrients, particularly water. Water is key because these seedlings are not watered. They're planted out and they basically grow on their own. There's no way you could actually water your seedlings unless they were right by your house. And so the way we favor or increase the amount of water available to seedlings, which is needed for photosynthesis, is to control to some level the amount of competing vegetation around seedlings, at least temporarily in the first year or two. And after that, if they establish and get free to grow, then you don't have to worry about it. The vegetation will come back. But anyway, we can look at shrubs and we can look at herbaceous vegetation like grasses, sedges, and forbs. And, grasses, their rooting zone is right in the same rooting zone as the seedlings. So they're very, very competitive with those seedlings in the first year or two that after the seedlings have been outplanted. So what do we know? We know that we can get increases in growth by controlling the vegetation up to about 10 feet around a seedling. Now, we know that that's not always practical, depending on the type of vegetation control you might use. We also know that competition from grasses or herbaceous vegetation, it can often be more limiting to survival and growth than competition from woody vegetation such as shrubs. But this varies a little bit, so you have to pay attention to actually both. So let's take a look at an example here of an example where the more vegetation was, varying levels of vegetation were controlled around some ponderosa pine on a mixed conifer site. So what this shows here is the seedling stem size. So if you think about a seedling and you think about its stem, the bigger the stem, the more vigorous it is because it's photosynthesizing, has a lot of water. So these treatments include a control, which is this one down here, which the seedlings were planted and nothing was done with the competing vegetation. Then the next one was they did a small spot control of about 2 feet around the seedlings. That's this one. Then they did a 5-foot spot of control around these seedlings. That's this graph, this curve. And then they did where they took a backpack sprayer and then kind of sprayed over the seedlings and controlled more of the vegetation around the seedlings. And then this other curve here is where they sprayed over the seedlings to control the grass, but they did it 2 years in a row. So they basically kept a very weed-free condition. Now, this last treatment is not practical, but it shows how these seedlings, after 6 years, their vigor. And so to show you an example, so this is a seedling that's 6 years old in the control treatment. It is not free to grow after 6 years. If you just control, 5 feet around the seedling, which is that curve, this is what the seedling looks like. This is 6 years old, and this is free to grow. Well beyond free to grow. It was free to grow before year 6. So the more you control the competing vegetation around the seedling that first year or so is extremely important. So another way to look at this is treating the vegetation early is better than treating it later. So again, a similar thing. I don't have a picture of these seedlings, but what we have here are seedlings that were treated. This is after 10 years. Seedlings were planted. These were fir seedlings. And this is seedling size here on the y-axis is that there's a control where the seedlings were planted, and you can see that the seedlings are small. They treated another set of seedlings the second 3 years. They didn't treat them the first 3 years. They treated them the second 3 years. And that did a little bit better than the control, but not significantly so. And then on this curve, they treated the vegetation around the seedlings the first 3 years, but didn't do any the last 3 years. So this one shows, compared to this one, that the earlier you control that vegetation, the better. And then, of course, this is the Cadillac one where they treated the vegetation all 6 years. Not practical, but it just shows you if you take away all the competition from a seedling, what it can do potentially genetically growing at its genetic potential. So if you can control a bit more vegetation, say 2 to 3 feet around a seedling and do it early in the first year or two, that is your best bet for getting seedlings free to grow. So how do you do that? Are we running out of time?
We're running out of time, about 5 more minutes if we can.
So, okay. All right. So we're going to I'm probably going to abbreviate this, but the way you do this early on after a harvest is through site preparation. That is, controlling the competing vegetation, the site preparation, it could be different methods. I'll talk about those, but site preparation can create planting spots. It can create reduce fuel or fire risk by reducing the amount of slash. This could be from piling and burning. It reduces habitat for certain animals that might damage your trees. And if for natural regeneration, site preparation can expose mineral soil, which would be important. Or you can improve soil conditions. If you have a compacted landing, you may want to rip that landing and restore the soil conditions so that it will grow trees. Okay, going through here fast. So the options are, and this depends on you, is using chemicals or herbicides as a spot spray, or maybe a broadcast spray around each seedling, mechanical, using some kind of equipment to reduce the amount of vegetation on the site. Manual, a lot of people do this, but it's very labor intensive, using a brush cutter. That's what this gentleman's doing, or using a hoe to, if it's grass, to kind of hoe out some of the grass. Very, very labor intensive. And of course, fire. Most landowners don't use fire or broadcast burning in a harvest unit, but that has been used in the past for sure, and on some cases is still used. I like these. If you're not interested in using herbicides, but mats can work very well for controlling competing vegetation immediately around the seedling, and depending on the type of mat, will control it for 2, 3, or 4 years. And then there's various combinations of site prep. But really, the option you select depends on the type of vegetation, your slash load, the soil type, presence of animals. And really it comes down to your objectives, your constraints, and your resources that you have to do this type of work. This is in the PowerPoint. I'm not going to go through this because we're running out of time, but you can look at the effectiveness and cost on a relative scale for these different methods, both for grass and herbaceous vegetation, as well as for shrubs. And this kind of gives you the method, the effectiveness and its duration, and the cost in a relative sense. Okay, so in post-fire situations, so let's say you had this part of your property, it burned, you decided you didn't have enough area to salvage, so you forego the salvage, but you still wanted to see if you could get natural regeneration. And this is after 5 years, and there's virtually no natural regeneration is coming in. And let's say you said, well, I want to get some trees reestablished on there. How do I do it? Well, this is, of course, a situation where competing vegetation now has a jump on anything that you might plant. So you may have to go back in and do some spot hand scarification, or maybe with a machine of some type, a masticator, if the slope will allow some machines on there. And so create these plantable spots that then you can plant trees in, and then come back and monitor them over time. And so but because of the jump on vegetation, your seedlings will need some kind of vegetation control. How you do it, with mats or grubbing, or with a spot herbicide, or with a mechanical kind of situation, that is up to you. Or if an area had been used, didn't salvage, and it was seeded with grass, that grass is a killer for young seedlings on drier sites. So it would also need some kind of spot vegetation control using the variety of methods I just talked about. And of course, if you're lucky and you were able to plant, had some surplus seedlings, or this landowner did, they decided not to salvage. They had some seedlings, and they planted immediately after the fire. The fire provided the site prep and the vegetation control. The only thing now they have to worry about is, as that vegetation comes back, will the seedlings make it, and maybe help them along. So I'm probably running out of time, but timing, we usually plant on the west side either in the fall, or in more cases in the winter. So December, January, February, maybe even to March. In the east side, it's usually spring, late March through May, depending on elevation and snow. think about a seedling. You got to keep it cool and moist from the time you pick it up to the time you plant it. And so thinking about the steps in transporting and taking it out to the site and only planting the number of seedlings you can plant in a day, keeping them cool and moist. There are a variety of different tools. You can, if you're only planting 100 trees or so, and you can use a regular shovel in your garage or your shed. But if you're going to be planting a lot of trees, you want a reinforced tree planting shovel or spade, or maybe even a planting auger like you see there with the chainsaw attachment, chainsaw motor. And there's a publication in there on how to properly plant your trees. I'm going to let you read that, but it's important to kind of not get any debris into the hole. You want the seedling roots to be right in the mineral soil. No snow. If you're planting in snow, no snow pockets in the hole, no organic matter in the hole. The seedling roots need to be right up against mineral soil. And probably this goes without saying, but you don't want to plant them too deep or too shallow, or have debris in the hole. If you don't plant a deep enough hole and you end up with, this is called a J root, is that a lot of times these seedlings don't do well and die because the seedlings are in a poor form, and they actually may dry out because instead of the seedlings being, if you could unroll those seedlings, the depth at which those seedlings need to obtain moisture is really important. And so by J-rooting, you reduce the rooting depth of the seedling. And this is a case here, a seedling that was planted way too deep, 4 inches too deep, and the seedling is not happy and not free to grow. And I like to look for favorable sites to plant trees. So in dead shade to kind of take the heat load off the seedling that first year. If you expect a lot of browsing, planting seedlings actually in slash where maybe the deer or the elk are less likely to go, it would be an important microsite. And obviously there are ways to protect seedlings either with tubes or some kind of protective devices, or maybe some kind of chemical repellent. Here they're spraying deer away on pine because this is a deer winter range that really hammers some of the seedlings. So I always recommend that if you plant seedlings, you should go back that first year and check on them. Look at their survival, their growth. Are they getting towards free to grow? Are they experiencing any damage? If you find problems, the sooner you can address it, the better it is, and the less costly it will be to fix it later. So after reforestation or after harvest, you have to replant after a commercial timber harvest or salvage. If you bring the stocking below some minimum standards, and you can check with the Oregon Department of Forestry on what that is for your area. But trees should be planted within 2 years unless you've written an alternate plan. So for example, with the current fire situation and the lack of seedlings, you may harvest some salvage harvest timber, but there may not be seedlings available. You could have a alternate plan written so that it gives you time, and so that you plant those seedlings. It may be 3 or 4 years after harvest, but at least it's written down and filed with the Oregon Department of Forestry. And I think I already mentioned that. The minimum stocking is 100 to 200 seedlings per acre, depending on site productivity. So I'm gonna end there. Because I want to leave time for questions. But I talked about the steps. It's going to be really important if you're doing salvage harvesting. You probably need to expect delays, one, either in trying to find a operator that can actually do the salvage harvesting. And that might take a year or more. And then the planting that would occur after that. So there might be some delays for some of you who have been impacted by fire. But the Oregon Department of Forestry will work with you on this. I know those folks pretty well. But one thing I wanted to mention here before we end is that we have some other webinars. There's a webinar series on the east side, the forest of Eastern Oregon. The last one is Thursday on biodiversity and forest ecosystem health. And for the tree school series that we have another one on making maps for management planning coming up December 8th. Don't miss that one. And another one on managing your forest with fire in mind, one of my favorite topics. And that's with a trio of our extension folks for December 15th. So with that, I thank you. I apologize for the rush at the end. I wish we could go out in the field and do this. It'd be a lot of fun. But we did want to find out if any of you had your property is burned and you think you're going to need seedlings. We are trying to help with that and want to know what your seedling needs might be in the next 1 to 3 years. And so if you could contact your local extension forester with this information, your name and contact, the location of your property and its elevation, because that gets to seed zone, in what years do you plan to plant seedlings, and how many acres do you plan to plant, and what species on those acres. So anyway. So sorry for the rush job, but I guess maybe we can take some questions, Alicia.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Steve. And I know folks, I'm seeing some people are jumping off. A reminder, this will be recorded. And so if you want to pop back on later and watch the very end of the questions or anything like that, you can do that. So one question that we have here is it reasonable to consider growing our own seedlings this year or next, given the potential shortages, or is this too cost prohibitive?
So growing your own, you mean growing them at home? Or
I think that's what that's my interpretation of growing your own seedlings on your property.
It's really pretty difficult. You got to collect your seed. You got to stratify the seed. That is, the seed just doesn't germinate on its own. And there's a lot of steps. There's a lot of kind of physiology that goes in with growing those seedlings like I showed you. Now you might have some what we call wildlings. You know, sometimes you got seedlings that are on like road cut banks that you could transplant. You might try some of those, but the smaller the seedling, the better. As far as being able to successfully transplant that. So it's very, very difficult to grow seedlings at home.
Thank you. And just so folks know, we're going to stay on and answer questions for about the next 15 minutes. So if you want to stick around and hear Steve's answers, great. Feel free to do so. So our next question is, what's the best time of year to plant seedlings?
I like to plant, most of them are be seen on the west side between December and early March. And for the east side, it would be late March, April, maybe early May for seedlings on central and eastern Oregon. And as I mentioned, depends on elevation. If you're planting up at 4,000 or 5,000 feet, you still got snow. It may be mid-May or late May before you're able to do that. Some timber companies actually on the west side plant in the fall, like September, October, but they do that with specially conditioned seedlings, so which they order ahead of time and purchase. But for most of the seedlings that you would purchase, they're not specially conditioned for fall planting like that. So the winter plant is really good.
Thank you. For folks, I see a lot of you have seen our ending poll, our wrap-up poll is on the screen. So please go ahead and answer that. We'd like your feedback. If you don't see it on your screen, go down to your toolbar and click on polls, and it should pop up there for you. So another question for you, Steve, is cone crop consistent for an entire area, or will the crop vary from region to region? So is cone crop production common to all or specific to areas and species?
It's kind of, I guess it would be dependent on how big of a region you go, but like, I was really surprised the last 3 years. So 3 years ago, we had a really good Douglas-fir cone crop. And then last year or the year before last, it was pretty low. But this year it was really good again. And it's just interesting to see, two good cone crops that close together. But even across the region, even when region-wide the cone crop may be low, there are still individual trees that may have cones on them that may be higher than the rest of the trees within the region. So, but there is seems to be like this synchrony between a region and a good cone crop year. Like all the trees or most of the trees have a moderate to good cone crop, for some of you, the seed comes from what we call seed orchards, and they actually, as I mentioned, the stress cone crop. These are healthy trees, but they actually stress them. They actually girdle half the circumference of the tree to trick the tree to think it's going to die, and it produces these cones that then are collected. But the tree has been healthy, and so the cone production is actually and the seed within the cone is actually filled with viable seed. So just a little story there.
Great. So what are your thoughts on planting slightly exotic species such as incense cedar or coast redwood a bit north of their range?
Yeah, well, Alicia and I and some of our extension groups are looking at redwood, but incense cedar. We have planted incense cedar here on the McDonald Dunn Forest on some of our harsh sites as one to test to see how well it does. And although we don't have a market here, I know there's a market down in Roseburg. There's a mill there that takes incense cedar. We don't have one here in the Willamette Valley, but we're testing some of these. I guess that would be, incense cedar is a native tree, but it's exotic for us up here. Depending on where you are down in Southwest Oregon, it may be a one you want to try. Redwood, there's a lot of people that have planted redwood, and it does pretty well across a lot of sites. We're still trying to, as an extension group, trying to tease that out a little bit more. Now, the market for redwood, the only mill I know that takes redwood is South Coast Lumber down in Brookings. But I've seen people plant like at least a test, like they'll plant an acre, or they might interplant Douglas-fir and redwood on their property just to see what it's going to do. So I'm okay with that. Just remember that if it's after a harvest, though, it has to be with a commercial species that is capable of meeting the Reforestation or Forest Practices Act.
Yep. So this question is about seed zones. When and why did they change the seed zones?
Well, if you look at the old seed zones, I'd bring it up, but particularly on the west side, it goes from the coast and it goes up over the coast range. It goes like they kind of go east to west a little bit, and across that range is a highly variable climate. And so we suspect that perhaps like with Swiss needlecast, that if you were planting Douglas-fir from the east flank of the coast range and planting it on the west side, that it may be off-site, maybe not a lot off-site, but it may be just enough that it's encouraging Swiss needlecast. Just some thoughts. So if you notice, they're kind of more north-south and along the range, the flanks of the coast range. And so they have looked at similar climate, and this is based on climate data, and so figuring that those trees would be adapted to a similar climate, north south, along that flank of the Coast Range, and the Cascade Range too.
Yeah. Let's see here. How are cones harvested for seed?
Okay, so in the past, sometimes they had a good friend of mine back in the day used to actually climb trees and collect cones by hand. In some cases, they might, if they had an area that they were going to harvest and there was a cone crop, they had helicopters that have this cone rake that goes over the top of the tree, closes, and then the helicopter goes up and basically rakes the cones off. And so it really does a number on the crown of the tree, but if you're going to harvest that stand, then it doesn't matter. In seed orchards, they pick that. I don't know if they have machines or people up on or by hand, but those trees, they may have lifts where they have people up actually harvesting the cones off of them.
Yeah, interesting.
But the good news that we heard is that there is still plenty of seed, despite the need that's going to be out there in the next year or two. There's still enough stored seed to grow the seedlings that potentially would be needed to reforest many of the burned areas on private property like yours.
Good. A couple questions on markets. So the first one is, how long for ponderosa pine to be marketable? I was told there are no mills to handle it.
Yeah, right now in the Willamette Valley, there is not. I'm trying to think if Roseburg down in Southwest Oregon, down in your country, Alicia, if they manufacture, they do.
Yep.
So if you were probably on the southern end of the Willamette Valley or in Douglas County, you probably have a market for ponderosa pine. Up here around Corvallis, where I'm at, and some of you folks who are probably from the northern Willamette Valley, there is no close market at this current time. It is what it is. I wish there was, because it grows really well on some of these sites that Douglas-fir does poorly on or doesn't grow at all.
Yeah. A couple other species folks are curious about markets, if there are any, for western white pine, and then a market for oak besides firewood.
Yeah, I have not seen a market for western white pine, and it's a beautiful wood. There used to be a market in northern Idaho. Obviously, Idaho is the white pine state, and that's where western white pine reaches historically was at its greatest development in those ecosystems up there. But here I have not seen a market for western white pine. The reason I like it is it grows well. It's resistant to root disease, it's not immune to root disease, but it's resistant. It grows on a lot of different sites. The only thing is it gets crenartium or a disease that can kill it. So it's like a rust. So, but anyway, white pine blister rust, sorry. So that's the only thing that affects it. Although, the seedlings have some resistance now through genetic resistance breeding, but it's not 100% resistant.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So at what point is the cone ready to harvest, and at what time of year? Yeah.
Okay, good question. So the cones for Douglas-fir, you'll see the pollen and female cones begin to develop in March and April. They're very hard to see, and it's hard to predict unless you're really looking at them. But as it gets into June or so, you can begin to pick out the cones developing. Those cones will develop over the summer. And by the time August comes and into September, that's when the cones, particularly if you get like a really dry east wind or really dry east wind conditions in September and early October, is when the cones will open up and the seed begins to fall. Now, sometimes the cone, and I've done this, sometimes the seed fall out of the cones can be protracted into December. So they may start to fall. If you get a rainy period, the cones, because they moisten up, they close. And then you get a drying period, they open again and the seed comes out. So it can come in fits and starts as far as so, but most of the seed will be out by November, the end of November, and on the ground.
Thank you. So we have one last question, unless folks, this is your last chance to ask Steve any of your burning questions. But this last one actually really isn't even a question. It's kind of a comment, and if you'd like to comment onto it. So Greg says that the flip side to the spacing topic, when we were talking about tree spacing, is that I would rather plant a tight 9x9 or 10x10 and get crown closures sooner to shade out brush and be free to grow. And at the same time, there's a study that shows that the tighter spacing also has the trees growing taller, which means you have less need for vegetation control and issues with animal damage. So would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, no, that is true about the one study where they planted them really tight and they actually grew a little taller, but you have to then thin them out to maintain that, because if you don't, then you lose that. I would, the problem in the past has been people waited too long to thin them out. And so they're like almost like tighter than a Christmas tree plantation, and then you've really reduced the growth potential. So I hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree with it. It's just that you're going to spend more money to plant those trees, and if you're doing it yourself, then you don't have to worry about your labor, I guess. And then you're going to maybe thin them out after they've kind of closed in and got that, they're shooting straight up. And then start taking some out to kind of capture that early growth. So I suspect if you had a site that had a lot of blackberry and things like that, maybe you want to do that to shade out that blackberry or any of the other kind of exotic weeds that a person might be plagued with. And so a little tighter spacing would shade them out.
Great. Well, a lot of good conversation and questions for you. Thanks for answering all of that. And thanks for everybody who hung on with us till the very end. At this point, we don't have any more questions, and I think this is a good time to wrap it up. So thank you, Steve, for your great presentation. If folks have questions, go ahead and send an email to Steve or get in touch with anyone here and we can connect you. And hopefully we'll see you all at the next Tree School webinar.
Don't forget the resources that are in the box that we provided, because I again apologize for having to speed through the end, but there's a lot more detailed information there for you. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Bye-bye.